The sun was just a fading memory now, slipping beneath the horizon like a whisper. The sky bled dark orange and purple, stretching endlessly above the small border village that had become a silent battleground. Fatima crouched low behind the sandbag line, her fingers tracing the rough fabric, as if it could somehow steady the trembling in her hands. The distant rumble of tanks rolled closer, each thud a reminder that this night could decide everything. Her squad, an all-female band of ordinary women forced into extraordinary roles, prepared quietly. They weren't trained soldiers. Most of them had never held a rifle before this war. But tonight, every heartbeat pulsed with the knowledge that if they faltered, the border would fall. The village, their homes, the families they loved, all could be lost. Fatima glanced to her left. Miriam, wrapped in a worn shawl, was tightening a strap on her rifle with hands roughened by years of tending the fields, not battle wounds. Her eyes, however, were sharp and unyielding. Beside her, Nora adjusted the bandage on her arm. Her husband had disappeared weeks ago, and now she fought with a fierce determination born of desperation. There was no room for fear, yet the weight of what they faced pressed down like the heavy, dusk air. The tanks weren't just machines. They were monsters tearing across the land, erasing everything in their path. And here they were, a handful of women, standing between destruction and survival. Fatima's breath caught. She thought of her younger brother, safe for now, tucked away, with relatives far from the fighting. This was for him, for the children asleep inside their homes, and for every silent prayer whispered in the night. Suddenly, a crackling from the radio broke the fragile silence. A voice, tired but steady, reported enemy movements closer than expected. The tank engines grew louder, shaking the ground beneath them. The women gripped their rifles tighter, knuckles white against the cold metal. The first flickers of gunfire sparked like lightning in the distance, and the tension snapped tight as a wire. Fatima's voice, calm but firm, cut through the murmurs. "Wait for my signal." Steady, steady. Her eyes scanned the horizon, searching the shadows for any sign of the advancing threat. The village was quiet now, too quiet, as if holding its breath with them. Then, through the growing darkness, the first tanks emerged, giants moving slowly but surely, their heavy tracks crushing the earth. Fatima's heart thundered in her chest. Every second stretched into an eternity. The women whispered prayers, not for victory, but for the strength to survive. The enemy was closer now, within range. Fatima raised her hand, a single sharp signal. Fire. The night erupted with sharp cracks and echoes as rifles spit fire into the air. Bullets tore through the dust, striking targets that flickered like ghosts in the twilight. Fatima moved swiftly, coordinating her squad, her voice steady despite the chaos. "Hold the line. Don't let them break through." The women returned fire, one after another, their aim fueled by something deeper than training. Love, fear, and fierce resolve. The ground shook with each blast, and a tank's engine roared as it veered slightly off course. For a moment, hope flickered. They were doing the impossible, holding the line against a force that seemed unstoppable. But the battle was far from over. Around Fatima, the cries of her sisters pierced the night, some from pain, some from determination. She felt the weight of every shot fired, every life hanging by a thread. There was no turning back. The border might have fallen if not for these women who refused to retreat. Their courage was a quiet storm, rising in the darkness, ready to change everything. Fatima's eyes flickered between the shadows where the enemy tanks pressed forward and the women beside her, their faces etched with exhaustion and determination. She knew every one of them carried a story heavier than their rifles. These weren't just fighters. They were daughters, mothers, Sisters who had been pulled from their everyday lives and thrust into a war that had no mercy. Miriam, the oldest of the group, was quiet but resolute. Fatima remembered the stories she had heard about Miriam's life, how she lost her husband to the first wave of the conflict, and had since become the sole caretaker of 3 grandchildren. Her weathered hands trembled as she adjusted her rifle, but her gaze was unyielding. Tonight, Miriam wasn't just protecting the border. She was protecting a future for those innocent souls depending on her. Noor sat nearby, pressing a cloth to her bleeding arm. Her husband had vanished weeks ago. No one knew if he was dead or alive. The uncertainty weighed on her like a stone, but it didn't break her. If anything, it steeled her resolve. For him, she whispered under her breath, I will not let this line fall. Her voice was soft but fierce, a promise carved in the night. Fatima's heart ached seeing these women, so ordinary and yet so extraordinary in this moment. None of them had chosen this fight, but all had embraced it, their fear swallowed by a fierce will to survive. She thought of her own family back home, the little brother who was too young to understand the war, the mother who had begged her to stay safe. But Fatima knew that safety was a luxury none of them could afford. Not here. Not now. The rumble of the tanks grew louder, each engine a cruel reminder of what was coming. The village behind them lay silent, every window dark, every door shuttered. Children had been sent away to safer places. The people they fought for were hidden, vulnerable, trusting these women to stand in their place. Fatima took a deep breath, tasting the dry air thick with dust and fear. Around her, the squad shifted nervously. Some glanced at one another, sharing silent strength. Others stared straight ahead, their fingers tightening on triggers. Fatima knew what they were thinking. How long could they hold? How many of them would fall before the dawn? But she pushed those questions away. There was no room for doubt here. A sudden noise to the right made Fatima snap her head toward the sound. A young woman, barely more than a girl, was fumbling with her rifle, panic flashing in her eyes. Fatima moved quickly to her side, placing a steady hand on her shoulder. Breathe, she said quietly. Focus on the moment, not the fear. The girl nodded, swallowing hard. Fatima saw herself reflected in that moment. The raw edge of terror tempered by resolve. You're stronger than you know, she whispered. We all are. Outside, the enemy was regrouping, the tanks repositioning for another push. Fatima could see their lights sweeping the horizon, searching for any weakness in the line. Her mind raced, trying to plan their next move. Every second was precious. She spoke softly but firmly to her squad. Remember why we're here. For our homes, for our families, for each other. We stand because we must. No one else will. The women nodded, drawing courage from her words. In that brief moment, the border wasn't just a line on a map. It was a promise. A fragile, burning flame held by women who refused to let it die. Fatima knew the road ahead would be long and brutal, but as she looked at the faces around her, she believed. She believed they could hold. Because sometimes, courage wasn't about strength or numbers. It was about refusing to give up, no matter the cost. The quiet before the storm was unbearable. Every second stretched out, thick with tension and the scent of dust and sweat. Fatima's fingers tightened around her rifle as the enemy tanks rumbled closer, their engines growling like beasts hunting in the night. The ground beneath them trembled, a slow, terrifying heartbeat counting down to battle. Suddenly, a sharp crack split the silence. The first shots fired from the enemy side, echoing through the darkness like thunder. Fatima's heart pounded in her ears as she raised her hand, signaling her squad to hold their fire. "Wait for my signal," she commanded, her voice steady but firm. The women obeyed, their rifles poised but silent, breaths held in anxious anticipation. The tanks advanced with relentless purpose, their heavy tracks crushing everything in their path. Shadows danced in the fading light, and the flicker of distant flames hinted at destruction already wrought. Fatima's eyes scanned the horizon, looking for the right moment. She knew that firing too soon would waste precious ammunition and give away their position. But waiting too long meant risking being overrun. A sudden movement caught her attention, a scout moving ahead of the main force. Fatima's voice dropped to a whisper, "On my mark." She counted the seconds in her mind, every tick of the clock louder than the last. Then, with a sharp breath, she shouted, "Fire!" The night exploded with gunfire. Bullets tore through the air, lighting up the darkness with brief flashes. Fatima's squad fired with precision, each shot a desperate gamble. One of the tanks lurched, its engine stuttering under the barrage. A cheer rose from the squad, quickly silenced by the ongoing battle. The enemy pressed harder, pushing through the dust and smoke. The air filled with the acrid smell of burning oil and the sharp sting of gunpowder. Fatima ducked behind the sandbags, feeling the impact of a nearby explosion vibrate through her bones. The world seemed to narrow to the fight in front of her. No past, no future, only this moment. Amid the chaos, a scream tore through the night. Layla had been hit. Fatima dropped her rifle and sprinted toward her, ignoring the bullets whizzing past. Kneeling beside Layla, she grabbed her arm, pressing a makeshift bandage to the wound. Layla's eyes fluttered open, pain mixed with determination shining through. "Keep fighting," she gasped. Fatima nodded, swallowing her fear. Around them, the squad was holding strong, their unity a shield against the onslaught. The women moved like one, covering each other's backs, sharing water, shouting encouragement. Every face was smeared with dirt and sweat, every breath labored, but no one broke. Time lost meaning. Minutes stretched into hours as the battle raged. Fatima felt exhaustion clawing at her limbs, but she refused to let it show. She knew that if she faltered, the squad might crumble. Her voice rang out over the gunfire, steady and commanding. "Hold the line. We can't let them through." Then, as suddenly as it had started, the enemy hesitated. The stalled tank gave the squad a moment's reprieve. Fatima seized the opportunity to rally her women. "Push back. Don't let them regroup." With renewed energy, the squad fired again, targeting the vulnerable machines. One tank caught fire, flames licking the night sky. The enemy began to pull back, their advance broken for now. Fatima sank back behind the sandbags, her chest heaving with exhaustion. The border still stood, held by a group of women who had nothing but courage and sheer will. The battle was far from over, but this night was their victory. In the silence that followed, Fatima glanced at her squad. Their faces were smeared with grime and streaked with tears, but their eyes shone with fierce pride. They had refused to retreat. They had stood when the world expected them to fall. And that made all the difference. Layla's cry cut through the chaotic roar of battle like a sharp knife. Fatima's heart lurched. She dropped her rifle and dashed toward the source, her boots pounding against the scorched earth. Bullets hissed past, embedding themselves into the sandbags and the cracked walls nearby. The scent of smoke and dust burned in her lungs, but she pushed forward without hesitation. She found Layla on the ground, clutching her side, eyes wide with shock and pain. Blood seeped through her fingers, dark and warm against the dirt. Fatima's hands moved quickly, fingers trembling as she tore a strip of cloth from her sleeve and pressed it firmly against the wound. "Stay with me," she whispered, voice low but urgent. Layla's breathing was shallow, ragged, but her eyes held onto Fatima's like an anchor in the storm. Around them, the squad fought on, their voices rising in desperate shouts and steady commands. Fatima glanced over her shoulder and saw Noor, firing rapidly, never faltering even as fatigue painted shadows under her eyes. Miriam was helping another squad member reload, her hands steady despite the chaos. These women, ordinary and extraordinary all at once, were weaving themselves into an unbreakable shield against the tide. The air was thick with smoke, the sharp smell of burning rubber mingling with sweat and fear. Fatima's ears rang from the explosion nearby, but she forced herself to focus on Layla. She pressed harder on the wound, biting back the urge to panic. The sounds of battle faded into a distant roar as she knelt there, the world narrowing to a fragile moment of life and hope. Fatima, Layla's voice was barely more than a breath, but it carried a fierce determination. "Don't stop." Fatima nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. She would not stop. Not when their homes, their families, everything they loved depended on them. With a final squeeze of a cloth, Fatima helped Layla sit up, leaning her against a nearby sandbag. She scanned the horizon, heart pounding. The tanks were regrouping, their movements slower now, but no less menacing. The enemy knew the line was holding, and they were gathering strength for another assault. Fatima wiped the sweat and grime from her face, then turned to the squad. "We can't lose her," she said firmly. "Keep her safe. We hold this line together." The women around her nodded, a silent promise passing between them. Despite the pain radiating from her side, Layla managed a small, defiant smile. "We fight as one," she said, voice steady now. "No matter what." Fatima felt a swell of pride. This was more than a battle. It was a bond forged in fire. Minutes later, Miriam's voice called out, breaking through the haze. "Incoming." The squad tensed as another wave of enemy forces surged forward. Fatima gritted her teeth and raised her rifle once more. The fight was far from over. Bullets flew, the staccato rhythm of gunfire punctuating the night. The women moved with practiced urgency, covering each other, calling out warnings, reloading swiftly. The borderline was alive with motion, a desperate dance between survival and surrender. Fatima's eyes locked on the enemy tanks advancing through the smoke. She steadied her breath, aimed carefully, and fired. The bullet struck true, and a sudden explosion rocked the earth nearby. A cheer rose from the squad, brief but powerful. But the cost was clear in every glance exchanged, every winced breath and faltering step. The women were tired, wounded, but unbroken. Their resolve was carved deeper into their faces with every passing moment. Fatima glanced at Layla again. She was breathing more steadily now, but the pain was etched in every line of her face. The squad had lost some of their light, but the fire inside them still burned brighter than ever. In the thick of the battle, Fatima understood that this was more than just a fight for territory. It was a fight for life, for hope, for the future of everything they held dear. And together, they would stand, no matter the cost. The night deepened, shadows swallowing the edges of the battlefield. Fatima could feel the cold seeping into her bones, but there was no time to think about the chill. The fight was relentless, the enemy pressing harder with every moment. The tanks had stopped their slow advance, but smaller units now darted between cover, trying to flank the women's position. Fatima scanned the horizon, eyes sharp despite exhaustion. Miriam was beside her, crouched low, face grim but steady. Her voice, when she spoke, was a quiet anchor amid the chaos. "We've held them this far," she said, "but they're coming again." Fatima nodded. There was no room for despair here, only strategy, courage, and raw will. The squad's ammunition was dwindling, and every bullet counted. The women shared what little supplies they had, conserving strength with each breath. Suddenly, a flash lit the darkness. A mortar shell exploded near the edge of their defenses. The ground shook violently, and a cloud of dirt and smoke enveloped them. Fatima felt a sharp sting in her shoulder, but ignored it. Miriam's quick hands grabbed her arm. "You're hit," she said quietly. Fatima's breath hitched, but she refused to let the pain slow her. She pressed her fingers against the wound, tasting blood, and shook her head. "Not now. We hold." Beside her, Noor was fighting fiercely, her eyes wild but focused. Fatima caught a glimpse of something in Noor's gaze, a fire not just for survival, but for justice. The war had taken so much from these women, yet they refused to surrender even a fraction of their spirit. The sound of a radio crackling interrupted the noise. A voice came through, shaky but clear. "Reinforcements delayed. Hold the line." The words sent a cold wave through Fatima's chest. They were on their own. No backup, no relief. Just the weight of the night and the enemy pressing in. Her mind raced, calculating their chances. Fatima swallowed hard and forced herself to focus. "Listen," she called out, "we fight not because we expect to win easily, but because we must. For our families. For our home." The squad tightened, their bond unspoken but unbreakable. Layla, now pale but still steady, gripped her rifle beside the makeshift medical station. The pain had dulled her, but the fire in her eyes remained fierce. As the enemy forces regrouped, Fatima felt the world narrow to the line before her. She breathed deeply, steadying herself against the weight of fear and fatigue. This was more than a fight for land. It was a fight for the right to exist. Suddenly, from the east, a flicker of light caught her eye. Headlights. Vehicles moving fast. Reinforcements. Hope surged like electricity through the squad. Fatima's voice rose, filled with renewed strength. "Hold on. Help is coming." The enemy faltered for a moment, their advance hesitating as the new force approached. The squad fired with fresh vigor, pushing back with everything they had left. The tanks roared once more, but now the battle was shifting. The women, battered and bruised, felt the tide beginning to turn. Fatima's shoulder throbbed with pain, but she stood taller, clutching her rifle like a lifeline. She looked at her sisters in arms, each one a story of sacrifice, strength, and unyielding hope. They had refused to retreat. They had held the line when all seemed lost. And now, with dawn approaching, the border still stood because of them. The first light of dawn crept over the horizon, casting a pale glow across the battered landscape. Fatima's body ached, every muscle screaming in protest, but she refused to sit or rest. The night had been a relentless battle, a test of endurance and will, and though the enemy's assault had slowed, the danger was far from over. Around her, the squad stirred, eyes heavy with exhaustion yet burning with defiant fire. Miriam's hands trembled slightly as she reloaded her rifle, but her gaze remained steady. Noor, grim-faced and quiet, scanned the surroundings, ever watchful. Layla lay against a makeshift stretcher, pale but alive, her whispered encouragements still echoing in their hearts. Fatima wiped the grime and sweat from her face and looked toward the horizon. The reinforcements had arrived just in time. The sound of engines and marching feet was growing louder, but the squad knew better than to lower their guard. The enemy was still near, scattered but dangerous, ready to strike again if given the chance. She moved to the edge of their position, peering through the early morning haze. The village beyond lay scarred, houses crumbled, fires still smoldering, but it had not fallen. Not tonight. That was their victory. A quiet, stubborn triumph carved out by women who had nothing but determination. Fatima's thoughts flickered to the families they protected, the children sent away, the elders hidden safely, the neighbors counting on them to stand firm. It wasn't just a line on a map anymore. It was the boundary between survival and annihilation, between hope and despair. The radio crackled, breaking the fragile silence. A voice, steady but tired, reported, enemy forces retreating, regrouping farther south. Relief washed over Fatima, but she kept her expression calm. There was still work to be done. She turned to the squad, her voice low, but filled with quiet pride. We did this. We held them off. But this is only the beginning. We have to stay strong, stay ready. Miriam nodded slowly. Tonight, we proved that strength isn't just in numbers or weapons. It's in heart. Fatima looked at Noor, whose eyes glistened with unshed tears. And in refusing to give up, they shared a brief smile. Small moments like these were lifelines amid the war's chaos. The world around them might be breaking, but in this moment, there was unity. There was hope. The wounded were tended to as best they could. Makeshift bandages and whispered reassurances traded in the dim light. Fatima knelt beside Layla, her fingers brushing a stray lock of hair from the younger woman's face. "You held on," she said softly. Layla managed a faint smile, her strength slowly returning. As the sun rose higher, the sounds of reinforcements grew clearer. More vehicles, more soldiers ready to fortify their fragile hold. Fatima knew their victory tonight was not just theirs, but belonged to everyone who refused to be broken by war. Her gaze lifted skyward, where the morning light painted the clouds with shades of pink and gold. The battle had been fierce, the losses heavy, but the border stood. Because these women had stood together, refusing to retreat, refusing to let fear dictate their fate. And as the day began, Fatima understood something deeper. Sometimes the most powerful battles were fought not just with weapons, but with courage, hope, and an unshakable will to protect what mattered most. The war was far from over, but in the fragile quiet that followed the battle, a new resolve took root. Fatima stood at the edge of their position, watching as reinforcements secured the perimeter. The women she fought alongside were worn and battered, yet their spirits burned brighter than ever. Miriam approached, leaning heavily on her rifle. "We held the line," she said, voice rough but steady. "They won't forget this." Fatima nodded. "Neither will we." The weight of the night's fight settled over them like a heavy cloak. Each woman carried wounds, some visible, others etched deep within their souls. They had stared death in the face and chosen to stand firm. It was a choice few would understand unless they had lived it. Fatima's thoughts drifted to the families waiting beyond the border, to the children's laughter muffled by fear, to the mothers praying silently in the dark. This line was more than earth and sandbags. It was the thin shield between hope and despair. Noor joined them, exhaustion shadowing her fierce eyes. "We may be tired," she said, "but our fight has just begun." Fatima looked at the horizon, where the sun rose higher, casting long shadows across the scarred land. The enemy was still out there, regrouping, planning their next move. But the women's stand had changed the course of the battle. They had shown that courage was not bound by age or gender. The squad gathered close, voices hushed but filled with determination. Plans were made to reinforce their position, to tend to the wounded, and to prepare for whatever came next. There was no room for doubt, only action. As Fatima moved among her sisters in arms, she saw the faces of women who had transformed from frightened civilians into fierce warriors. Each carried a story of loss and sacrifice, yet none wavered in their commitment. Their unity was their strength. The sun climbed steadily, illuminating the path ahead, uncertain but undeniable. Fatima felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders, but also a fierce pride. They had refused to retreat. They had fought with everything they had, and they had won this battle if not the war. In the quiet moments between preparation and anticipation, Fatima allowed herself a breath. She looked toward the future, knowing it was fragile, uncertain, but also knowing that as long as they stood together, there was hope. Their story was no longer just about a border. It was about resilience, about standing tall when the world expected them to fall, about refusing to let fear define them. And in that moment, beneath the rising sun, Fatima vowed to keep fighting, not just for survival, but for the promise of peace that every dawn could bring. Fatima stood silently as the sun climbed higher, casting warm light on the worn faces around her. The battle had been won, but the war was far from over. She watched her squad tending to the wounded, their movements careful but steady. Each woman carried invisible scars, memories etched deep into their souls. Still, their eyes held a quiet strength that no hardship could break. The border they defended was more than a line drawn on a map. It was a symbol of their courage, their resilience, and their unyielding spirit. Fatima's heart swelled with pride and sorrow all at once. Pride for the women who refused to retreat, sorrow for those who had fallen, and for the countless lives forever changed by this conflict. In the distance, the enemy had retreated, their tanks and soldiers disappearing beyond the horizon. But Fatima knew it was only a matter of time before they returned. The scars of war ran deep, and peace was fragile. She felt the weight of that truth settle heavily on her shoulders. Yet, as she looked around at the faces of her sisters in arms, she saw hope shining through the exhaustion. Miriam, still bandaged but resolute, shared a brief smile with Noor, whose eyes burned with fierce determination. Layla, though weakened, lifted her head and whispered words of encouragement. Together, they were more than a squad. They were a force forged in fire and unwavering solidarity. Fatima took a deep breath, feeling the cool morning air fill her lungs. She thought of the families waiting beyond the border, the children who would sleep safely tonight because of their stand. She thought of the promise they had made to each other, to protect, to fight, to never back down. The village behind them was scarred, buildings crumbled and streets littered with debris, but it stood. That was their victory, fragile but real. It was a testament to what could be achieved when ordinary people found extraordinary strength within themselves. As reinforcements arrived to bolster their defenses, Fatima gathered her squad close. Her voice was low but firm, carrying the weight of all they had endured. We have held the line today. Tomorrow, we will hold it again. Not because it is easy, but because it is necessary. Because this is our home, our future. The women nodded, their resolve unshaken despite the trials ahead. They knew the road would be long, and the dangers many. But together, they had already proven that retreat was not an option. Fatima glanced once more toward the horizon, where the sky stretched wide and endless. The border might have been a line on a map, but for them, it was a line drawn in courage and hope, a line that would not fall. And as the sun rose fully, bathing the land in light, Fatima knew this was only the beginning of their story. A story of strength, sacrifice, and an unbreakable will to protect all they held dear.